Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, if the Timberwolves were able to exercise a trade for the call it number 3 pick in the NBA draft, and Scoot Henderson wasn't on the board, who might they take? I'll make the case for why Brandon Miller of the University of Alabama could be a good pick for the Wolves if they were to trade into the early portion of this year's NBA draft lottery. It's all coming to the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
That Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Happy Tuesday, everybody. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. This show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. You can find this show. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app. That's on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. This show, along with all the other Minnesota Locked On podcasts, are available on the app. More great local sports coverage 24/7 for free. Download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at my account, which is at Beecken, and that's with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. All right. So about a week and a half ago on the show, I think it was a week ago Friday, I talked about Scoot Henderson as a potential Timberwolves draft selection if the Wolves were to trade all the way up to number 3. That was, in the scenario that Brandon Miller essentially, really the only way this plays out in the top 3 is either Scoot Henderson goes 2, and one of a few players goes 3. Or if Brandon Miller goes 2, it's very likely Scoot Henderson gets picked 3rd. So I talked about Scoot Henderson a couple of weeks ago, and that was kind of my take was like, hey, the Wolves get to 3 and he's there. Or maybe they have something in place, call it, say they work something out where like, hey, if he's on the board, we'll consummate this trade to get up to 3 with Portland and take Scoot Henderson. The other possibility is the Wolves could engineer a trade for 3 and say to themselves, and I don't know if they're saying this, but I could make the argument that Scoot Henderson and Brandon Miller of the University of Alabama are equally attractive prospects for the Wolves for different reasons. I want to start with the obvious acknowledgement that like the only way this happens is in the event of a Karl-Anthony Towns trade. It's very unlikely that Well, it's impossible because the Wolves aren't trading Anthony Edwards or Jaden McDaniels. Like, we're not even having that conversation. The only way that this is even relevant is if Cat is traded. And I've said all along in the show, 75-25, he's not traded this offseason. That's kind of been my take. But it's obviously the question that the next month hinges on for the Wolves is whether or not that's even feasible. There was a report from Friday from Eric Pincus at Bleacher Report that multiple executives think the Wolves are open to it, and a few actually think it's I forget the exact wording he used, but that it's very possible he's traded. Essentially, I'm paraphrasing, in the next few weeks. I talked about that possibility again on the show on Monday of this week. I should also note that Darren Wolfson over at his Score North podcast in the Twin Cities talked on his show. I think it was actually Monday. Basically, he said, hey, nobody I'm talking to thinks this is about to happen. He talked about talking to officials from a couple of teams that are logical, what he called logical potential trade partners or landing spots for Karl-Anthony Towns, that the executives from those teams have heard. The word he used was crickets and have not had any trade dialogue with the Wolves. So my sense is that Pincus's sources from these other teams are, I don't know this, but I'm sure Pincus floated it like, hey, could Cat be traded? And they all said, yeah, it would make sense. Wouldn't surprise me based on the salary stuff, based on the fact that his salary goes up to $50 million a year from this fall. But I doubt there's any actual like trades out there that have been discussed that are now being reported here. And as Wolfson says, he admits he's only talked to 2 executives from 2 teams, but they haven't had any dialogue at all with the Wolves. It's not just like, hey, Minnesota's not necessarily just putting out feelers. This means they're likely not doing that, right? If teams are calling on Cat, the Wolves are going to have that conversation because it's going to be easier to trade him now than it will be in a year, most likely because of the salary stuff. So I'm acknowledging all of this now, and I believe Darren Wolfson even says on his show that I don't remember the exact word he uses, but basically says he'd be surprised if the Wolves were to trade him soon. And I mean, like, that's kind of where I've been at too. All that to say, it's draft season. It's a pretty unusual spot to be in as somebody who covers the Wolves, to not be talking about draft prospects, not be fantasizing about the next potential star um, at any point in the first round. And we will talk some second round in the coming days because I think it's important to get a sense for who could potentially be on the board at number 53 and could be options for the Wolves with the second round pick that they own. But let's talk a little more first round. Like, it was fun talking about Scoot a couple of weeks ago. And if the Wolves were to make a trade, and again, likely with Houston, I don't think the Wolves are trading with Charlotte for number 2. I don't even really want to like I guess it's possible Charlotte could say, hey, let's pair Karl-Anthony Towns with the Melo Ball. I don't know I'm pretty sure that's not feasible on a couple of different levels, so I'm not even going to go there. This trade becomes less likely with Houston at number 4 for a couple of reasons. One, because I don't think Houston you'd almost need a third team involved from a salary perspective to make a trade between the Rockets and Wolves work. And also 4 is significantly less valuable, in my opinion, than 2 or 3 would be in this draft. Now, some would argue there's a clear tier 1, obviously, and then a tier 2, and then maybe a gap before you get to 3 and 4 together. I would argue that 2 and 3 are much closer. And I think we've started to see that a little. Like, I think Scoot Henderson's being mocked again, back up at 2, and Brandon Miller at 3. But we already talked about Scoot. I want to talk about Brandon Miller today because, again, I think if the Wolves were to trade for the third pick, he's a real option there. And I don't think he slides to 4. In fact, sitting here right now, I think it's actually more likely Brandon Miller gets picked second. Or excuse me, I think it's more likely Scoot Henderson gets picked second and a team potentially trades with Charlotte to get to 2 and take Scoot, because I think maybe it's likely that more teams value Scoot Henderson and his skill set than Brandon Miller, who is more of a this isn't the right term, but quote unquote traditional wing, right? Like, Scoot Henderson is potentially a superstar playmaker nearly from day one with really impressive athleticism, huge upside. Brandon Miller has some upside, but not in the same way. And there's a lot of guys with not a lot of guys with his size and scoring touch necessarily with that combination, but he looks a lot more like your traditional NBA prospect, right? Whereas Scoot Henderson has some potentially, I don't want to say generational, but unique skills that you're not going to find in every draft, combined with his physical profile, as we talked about in that show about a week and a half ago. So what I want to do today is lay out the Brandon Miller stuff a bit more, talk about him as a prospect, why I actually like his fit with Minnesota. And if the Wolves were to trade with, say, Houston at 3, or excuse me, Portland at 3, or if somehow, say he's on the board at 4, the Wolves work something out with Houston, like say they cover Brandon Miller, pretty unlikely, but say that's how it shakes out. Why I like him as a prospect and his fit with Minnesota, and I actually think he's going to be a pretty good fit almost regardless of where he goes in this draft. So let's talk about Brandon Miller as a prospect for the rest of the show here today, and also what a potential fit on the Wolves roster would look like. So we're going to do all that here today for the rest of the show. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at eBay Motors. For a championship team, it's all about making sure that every player is a perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to my garage and look for the green check to know that the part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items apply. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, every day or the rest of this week, we will be talking primarily draft, any potential trade rumors that come up, but I do want to get into some second round prospects. So we'll do that here the rest of this week. We're within a week and a half now of draft night. A week from Thursday is the draft. So a lot to get to here in the coming days. All right. Brandon Miller is a prospect. So Brandon Miller is a one and done player for the University of Alabama. And I think his physical profile just screams NBA wing, right? He's 6'9", 6'11" wingspan, actually a similar physical profile to Jaden McDaniels, at least in terms of his size and frame. And I do want to come back to that comparison here in a minute. We'll get to that comparison here pretty quickly. Again, this is if a Karl-Anthony Towns trade were to happen and the Wolves ended up with 3, potentially 4. How does Brandon Miller profile as an NBA player, and how could he fit with the Wolves roster? In my opinion, one of the reasons he's so attractive to me, if the Wolves are in this position, is because I think he's a high floor player. I think that the range of outcomes for him is probably more narrow than, say, a Scoot Henderson. I believe Scoot Henderson has a higher ceiling than Brandon Miller, but really only because of the athleticism. I think that Brandon Miller from day one will do more things at an NBA caliber level than Scoot Henderson, and actually has maybe a closer ceiling than people would expect, simply because of his scoring touch. And we'll get more into that. So let's start with him as a prospect overall, and then why I think he slots into the Wolves well. I think he's got a higher floor than, say, Jaden McDaniels did as a prospect. I'm going to do a lot of comparing here because of their size, and they effectively play a similar position. McDaniels was thought of as likely a 4 coming into the league. Obviously, he's been more of a 3 lately, and I think that's where he sticks. Probably Brandon Miller is in the same boat. Again, both 6'9". I think McDaniels' wingspan is, depending on where you look, a half inch to an inch longer, or at least it was when he was drafted. It's probably, I think it's over 7 foot now. Miller's is listed at 6'11" in terms of his wingspan, again, 6'9" for his height. And that size, like, you obviously can't teach that, and he's very fluid. He's an incredible ball handler, and he was the primary scorer, obviously, at a very good Alabama team last year. And that to me is nice. Most guys who are going to get drafted this early in the first round did that in college, right? They were the primary guy. That's certainly the case with Brandon Miller. But what I like about him is, I think, again, as a high floor player, he's plug and play at the NBA level as almost a 3-and-D type wing. Although and we'll talk about his defense. I don't think the defense is quite up to snuff yet, but he's a really good catch and shoot guy. He was about 40% in catch and shoot situations, not just threes, but overall jumpers, about 40% last year, which it primarily was threes at Alabama, which is a really nice number for a college freshman. And the shot is repeatable. It's smooth. Again, it looks better than Jaden McDaniels did when he was coming into the league, in my opinion. There's a little bit it's not a hitch. Miller brings the ball down a little lower than you like him to, but it's a quick release, again, repeatable. He looks very comfortable and fluid. For somebody of his size to be able to catch and shoot the way he does, and also put the ball on the floor the way he does, and be again, fluid is probably the best way to say it. And that also includes not just initiating offense, but open floor situations when he's a secondary option, catch and shoot, pump fake and drive. Not an outstanding first step. We'll talk more about some of the weaknesses here in a minute, but he's long enough. He's got big strides, long strides, and really, really good touch. And one of the things I was most impressed about watching a ton of different clips of Brandon Miller was the touch that he scores with. That's something that, say, Jaden McDaniels didn't have when he was coming into the league, and I think has started to develop a little bit more. But the touch is very natural with Brandon Miller. Floaters, which is really more of kind of a doesn't really jump as much on his floaters, but he has a really nice step through move. He went to a bunch, maybe a little bit too much in college that it seems was getting anticipated towards the end of the season. But the touch from anywhere on the floor is something that you really can't teach. And again, McDaniels, I think, has improved, and something you can improve with repetition, but it's such an important piece of being a good offensive player. It seems obvious, but when you can see it in multiple facets of his game. So, like, for instance, he was an 86% free throw shooter. The volume you'd like to be a little higher for how much the ball was in his hands, but 86% at the line. He was 38.4% from outside the arc at Alabama. And those are really strong numbers. He didn't finish through contact great. He wasn't awesome at the rim. And again, didn't draw quite enough fouls to get to the line as much as you'd like him to. But the 3-point touch, the mid-range touch is also good. The free throw line touch, it's really more a matter of strength and building the upper body strength, the ability to finish through contact at the NBA level. That's a tough thing to learn on the fly, but a lot of guys coming into the league have to learn those things. The scoring touch from everywhere else is really impressive. And again, very, very important. In fact, let's compare a little bit here between he and Jaden McDaniels. Similar size, McDaniels is a better athlete. He just is. Brandon Miller has better scoring touch, better feel, I think better mechanics. Certainly much more comfortable with the ball in his hands and pick and roll game. That's another thing. Like, if Brandon Miller ends up on the Wolves, he's not initiating offense, right? Like, he'd be option. I don't know that he probably would be in the starting lineup if there was a Towns trade, which is, again, probably the only way he's in a Timberwolves uniform. I mean, like, your option at least 4, if not 5, in a lineup with Mike Conley, Anthony Edwards, Jay McDaniels, Rudy Gobert. Like, Ant's initiating basically everything. You've got Conley, you've got Rudy, and McDaniels would be ahead of Miller in the pecking order. So he doesn't need to be initiating offense, but he can. He was actually a pretty good pick and roll initiator at 6'9" at Alabama. Assist to turnover wasn't great. He turned the ball over more than he had assists, but it seemed to be just as much. And I didn't see the full tally, but like at times was a little bit loose with his handle. Even though overall for his size, he's really good at he has a good handle, as much as it was sloppy passes. And the instincts again are very good. He's very good with both hands as a passer, and the touch on the shot and the feel in the half court offense are again so important that you really can't teach. And that gives you such a solid floor as an NBA prospect. In grand scheme of things, you take the size, 6'9" with the 6'11" wingspan, the scoring touch, and layer into the scoring touch, not just the film, but the numbers back it up. The 38% from three, the 86% from the line, the overall effective field goal shooting percentage of true shooting of 58% in college, effective field goal of 53% in college. That backs up the eye test. And then you add the offensive feel, both in pick and roll game, taking guys off the dribble, catch and shoot situations, with the only real thing on offense to work on besides cutting back on turnovers, which should come naturally when you're less a part of primary actions in offense at the NBA level. The only real thing you have to work on, drawing fouls and finishing through contact in the paint, that's a pretty good offensive prospect. The only thing as a prospect profile that I'd be concerned about is a relative lack of athleticism for a high lottery pick, a guy who's going to go in the top 4, maybe 5 picks. That's the only real concern. Like, you don't usually take guys that aren't great athletes that high in the NBA draft. But if you have a floor as high as I believe he does, because he's so good in all these other areas, then that's a quote unquote risk I think you'd have to be willing to take, because he, again, the high floor profiles as a rotation NBA player almost immediately for all the reasons I just listed: the size, the scoring touch, the offensive feel in the half court. And because of that touch and the feel, the offensive ceiling for me is very high, even with the relative, keyword relative, lack of athleticism. I want to talk a little about his defense and finish the McDaniels comparison between the two of his prospects, and that's how we'll close the show here today. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is also brought to us by our title sponsors of the show. That's our friends over at FanDuel. Make your way to FanDuel, because right now new customers can get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. I should have mentioned off the top of the show, I'm recording this actually after the Denver Nuggets beat the Miami Heat in Game 5 of the Finals and, of course, won the series in 5 games. So I had said at the start of the series I thought it would be a 6-game series win for Denver. They did it, and won better in 5. So hopefully that's what you did over at FanDuel. Hopefully that's what you threw your dollars behind. But, of course, you can bet on tons of sports over at FanDuel. There's no better place to bet all the action from all the sports in America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get a no sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's $2,500. FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, finishing up the Brandon Miller conversation, I talked all about his offensive game and how impressive I think it is. Defensively, I think he steps in day one and is a passable NBA defender in one-on-one situations against most guys he's going to be matched up against. Um, I think that the ceiling as a defender is probably above average. I think he could be an above average NBA defender. I think it's easy to look at his size and assume he's going to be a Jaden McDaniels like defender. But even if McDaniels struggled a bit as a one and done player at the University of Washington and his rookie year, and really, I thought for parts of his second year as a pro, defensively, there were some issues. He still looked better defensively than Brandon Miller did at Alabama last year. And again, there's a lot of upside there because of the size, because of the offensive IQ. Clearly, a lot of times guys who have that level of offensive IQ, they get it on defense too, and it's a matter of effort. I think that's part of it. I think that the consistent effort, that's certainly part of it. But I don't know that the defensive feel is naturally as strong. I think McDaniels is a very balanced defender. And again, I'm continuing this comparison because at face value, you'd assume they're similar prospects. And I actually do want to get into some numbers from their, they each played one season in college. I do want to get into some of those numbers because I think it helps build some perspective here. McDaniels was always more as fluid. I keep using the word fluid as Brandon Miller is on offense. McDaniels felt that fluid defensively, always had good balance. Not always, but often had good balance. McDaniels did coming into the league, and you never worried about him getting, turning his hips too far one way or the other. And that's, I would say, Brandon Miller's primary issue is sometimes closing out too hard, shading a player too hard to one side, not being able to flip back the other way if the player crosses over, change direction. That's the biggest concern. Also, the moderate athleticism limits the ceiling, usually defensively, not all the time. I mean, you look at like a different player, different position, obviously, but like Desmond Bane, who has a negative wingspan, arms shorter than his height, and a moderate, he's an above average athlete, I guess, but doesn't necessarily jump off the page from a profile perspective, but he's a really good defender. There's exceptions to the rule, certainly. But when you think of top flight perimeter defenders, top flight shot blockers, switchable, versatile wings, guys that you could do a variety of things with defensively, you think of great athletes. And Brandon Miller's not a great athlete. He's a good athlete. But some of the burst that isn't always there with the first step on offense or finishing at the rim, we kind of see that defensively too. If he closes out too hard or shades too much in one direction or the other, he can get beat on defense. He's got the size and length to make up for that and to recover, but that's going to become less easy to do at the NBA level. So I think he's going to be a solid team defender because he seems to be a smart and intelligent player, understand spacing, generally understand the team concept. But I don't think he's going to come in and be like a 3-and-D guy right away. Even if the 3-point part's there and he's a call it a 38, 39% 3-point shooter, something like that at the NBA level from day one, I don't think he'll be a clear plus defensively. Now, again, back to the conversation, if he slots in with the Wolves, you put him in a lineup with Mike Conley, Anthony Edwards, Rudy Gobert, Jaden McDaniels. Like all four of those guys are plus defenders. I mean, Mike Conley at this point's maybe a slight plus, but as a team defender, he's very good. He's not a liability. And you still have Anthony Edwards and Jaden McDaniels as your top two options to guard the best perimeter offensive players on the other team. So you don't need Brandon Miller to be a phenomenal defender from day one. He may be like rotate back in with the bench unit and be your primary defender off the bench. Like, I suppose if you bring back Nickeil Alexander-Walker, that's not the case. If you bring back Taurean Prince, you're still going to give him the tougher assignment. And again, we're talking about a guy who's 6'9", so he's not necessarily guarding ball handlers straight up like McDaniels will at times. He doesn't have the fluidity on defense as McDaniels does, I don't think, to guard point of attack at the NBA level yet. But all that to say, the Wolves have enough really strong defenders that they can get a big-bodied guy with a big wingspan and good know-how and feel on both ends of the floor to kind of plug in as like your next line defender, right? You're not relying on him to be a 3-and-D guy from day one or a phenomenal defender from day one. Fit into the team concept, do what's asked of you, and be a solid defender. And that's all they'd be asking to Brandon Miller. He actually slots in really well with the Wolves as a high floor, reasonably high ceiling guy. If you're trading Karl-Anthony Towns, and in this scenario, you're getting back, say you're trading with Portland, and we've talked about the Anthony Simons possibility, et cetera, or if it's a 3-team deal and you're trading with Houston, maybe you get Tari Eason back from Houston and he plugs in as your 4 and Miller could come off the bench or whatever, and you slide McDaniels to 3, or I guess that's what he's playing right now is the 3. So there's some different possibilities here, but I really like Brandon Miller as a high floor, reasonably high ceiling player with strong offensive touch, really good feel, I think, on both ends of the floor, moderate athleticism, especially for drafting that high. But there's enough natural talent there, especially, again, I keep going back to the offensive touch, that it would justify him as a selection at number 2, but especially number 3 or 4 in the NBA draft. The last point I want to make about the Jaden McDaniels comparison is there's a reason, obviously, Brandon Miller is going to be a top 5 pick and McDaniels fell out of the lottery. Part of it is maturity, although there's, some questions. I don't want to dig too much into this because I don't have the full story. I'm not in these draft interviews with Brandon Miller. There's some questions there, but the actual results, as athletic and tantalizing as McDaniels was, and he was a 5-star recruit as a high school guy, he was considered to be a likely lottery pick going into his college season. McDaniels only shot 40% from the field, 34% from 3 at Washington, struggled in Pac-12 play, was much better in the non-conference schedule. But you compare the rate-based stats, and Brandon Miller was better almost across the board. He had a much better rebound rate. Brandon Miller had a 12.6% total rebound rate. McDaniels was 10.6%. Defensive rebound rate also beat him by 2% there. The assist rate, this surprised me a little. McDaniels actually had a higher assist rate, and we talk a lot about Brandon Miller's feel. That to me was mostly because of some of those highlight passes. He also just scored for himself a lot. And, I don't know that his feel as a ball handler in the pick and roll will translate to a distributor, an actual facilitator role at the NBA level, at least not right away. But again, that's why you have Anthony Edwards, Mike Conley, even Jaden McDaniels at this point, Jordan McLaughlin, whoever else off the bench, whoever the backup point guard is. You're not relying on Brandon Miller as a rookie to be doing those things for a team that expects to be in the playoffs. But all that to say, there is some future development there in terms of assist rate, but also steal rate. Actually had a slightly higher steal rate than Jaden McDaniels did, and a block rate that wasn't to where Jaden McDaniels was, but a slightly higher steal rate. He also, the turnover rate was much, much lower than Jaden McDaniels. So again, I go back to the offensive polish is clearly there in a way that was just completely absent for Jaden McDaniels. But McDaniels still the overall leg up when it comes to the defensive level of comfort. And again, the athleticism really separated the two in terms of ceiling. I think given what we've seen in McDaniels' offensive growth in the last 3 years, it's reasonable to say McDaniels still has a higher ceiling than I would even say Brandon Miller does right now. But Brandon Miller doesn't have as far to go because the offensive game is already there. Now, again, the limited not limited, the reasonably relative level of athleticism for Miller limits his overall total end of career ceiling, sure, but the offensive touch is real. And I think he is plug and play a rotation guy for a playoff team in the NBA, ideally probably a bench piece, but can play both forward spots and be deployed in a team defense very comfortably. So I like Brandon Miller as a prospect a lot. I don't think it's the level that the Wolves say, hey, we're trading Karl-Anthony Towns. We could take Scoot Henderson or we could take Brandon Miller. We're fine with either one, so let's make the deal for number 3 and we'll take whoever's there. I don't think we're at that level. But if I'm in the Wolves front office, I could argue myself into either Scoot Henderson or Brandon Miller as really fine potential additions to the team. Again, I go back to if the Wolves were forced to trade Karl-Anthony Towns, which they're not, but like if Cat woke up tomorrow and said, hey, you got to trade me, I'm going to be unhappy. And the Wolves said, well, we might get more for him this offseason than we would next offseason anyway. Let's just pull the trigger. then you could trade and get to 3 and feel good about either one of these guys in a Timberwolves uniform. I really believe that. I think they're both. I actually think the higher floor and the plug and play nature of Brandon Miller is a little more attractive to me. If you think you're going to be a playoff team this year, say if Cat's out of the picture with Ant, Rudy, Mike Conley, you got your 36-year-old point guard. Let's do it. We need a plug and play guy who still has a reasonably high ceiling. Brandon Miller's your guy. And I think I would probably make that argument. Now, if you're at 3, you take whoever's there, right? If Brandon Miller goes 2 to Charlotte, then you take Scoot Henderson. We already had that conversation a week and a half ago, and you feel good about that too. So both are fine answers to the question of who you'd take at number 3. Now, the real question is Karl-Anthony Towns still on the Timberwolves in the next 2 weeks? Is he still on the Timberwolves in July when the draft's all said and done and he officially could be traded starting on July 7th? I still think the answer is yes, but we don't know that for sure. And we'll obviously keep an eye on it and talk about it as warranted here at Locked On Wolves. All right, that's all we got for you today. Thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. This show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch the show on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You could also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.